When the first fragments were pulled from the earth near ancient Eridu, something troubling appeared in the wedge-shaped lines of Sumerian cuneiform. These weren't just records of kings or grain. They described a world cracking apart, not metaphorically, but quite literally. The skies grew dark, the land split, temples fell in silence as if abandoned mid-prayer. And within that quiet clay, one idea repeated in whispers, that Earth had been damaged in a war among beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, and that those gods, who once shaped humanity itself, left not in triumph, but in haste. Some tablets speak of Enlil's wrath, others of a great council fracturing, a decision made in urgency, not peace. Across various temple sites, Nippur, Sippar, and Lagash, archaeologists have unearthed hymns and lamentations that don't just mourn flood or famine. They speak of betrayal among gods and a retreat from Earth that left silence behind. Welcome. I'm truly glad you're here tonight. If the day has been heavy, if your thoughts have felt crowded, now is your time. Just for a while, let the weight drop. You've arrived in a place of calm wonder, where history breathes slowly and time unfolds like sand sifting through open fingers. I'm honored to be with you tonight, to explore something vast, quiet, and deeply human. What makes this story unusual is that it doesn't come from a single grand myth. There's no unified epic that declares, this is why the gods fled. Instead, we find fragments, lines pressed into tablets around 2100 BCE. Temple complaints scratched beside flood records, dismissed reports once thought to be symbolic, later re-examined for their consistency across regions. Mainstream scholars interpret the departure as metaphor. They argue these stories reflected ecological collapse, climate-driven migrations, or political implosions as city-states faltered. There is, after all, evidence of a massive drought around 2200 BCE, and charred strata in cities like Ebla and Mari suggest conflict or abandonment. But then, there are details that linger, descriptions of divine assemblies breaking down, of powerful beings arguing over humanity's future, and of a sky flashing with signs no farmer could explain. Some researchers, cautious yet curious, wonder aloud, were these stories echoing something more deliberate? A technological war recast in sacred terms? A fracture not just of climate or governance, but of intention? They don't claim certainty, but they don't dismiss the question either. We're not here to settle debates tonight. We're here to rest and wonder. This journey won't offer answers wrapped in certainty. Instead, it offers glimpses, ancient breaths frozen in clay, stories buried not just by time, but by interpretation. And still, they rise again. What captivated the scribes of Lagash, what stirred the priests of Kish, still hums beneath our feet. Perhaps what truly matters is not what happened, but why humanity needed to preserve the idea that gods, once present, had to leave. Take a breath. Let it settle in your chest. Where are you listening from tonight? A city apartment? A quiet house? Somewhere beneath stars? Or behind curtains pulled against the night? Wherever you are, let your shoulders ease, your jaw soften, your breath slow. You're in no rush now. You've arrived where stories move at the pace of ruins and rivers. If this kind of peaceful, thoughtful exploration brings you comfort, I'd be grateful if you liked or subscribed. It helps others find their way here too. And thank you, sincerely, for listening. Across the dried riverbeds of ancient Mesopotamia, Archaeologists have knelt where ziggurats once touched the sky. They've uncovered shards of story, not whole enough to shout, but too persistent to forget. Burn layers that cut off temple floors mid-ritual, texts that speak of divine departure, not with triumph, but with grief. We'll explore them slowly, together. We'll walk the cracked stones of Nippur, sit beside the broken stairways of Eridu, and trace the echoes that still live in symbols older than language itself. Somewhere between clay and constellation, the story waits. It begins, as many do, with silence. And from here, we move gently into the forgotten world that came before. Long before ziggurats rose from the plains of Sumer, long before cuneiform carved meaning into clay, there was only water, wind, and a land deciding what it would become. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, the earth breathed with glacial rhythm, quiet, slow, shaping itself in silences that lasted thousands of years. The rivers had not yet settled. They wandered, braided like sleeping serpents, meandering through marshes and lowlands, changing course after each seasonal flood. What we now call Mesopotamia was, for millennia, a restless canvas of silt, stone, and shifting sky. Following the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago, global temperatures rose. Slowly, deliberately, glaciers retreated northward, and with their absence came new rains, rising seas, and the birth of the alluvial plains that would cradle the earliest human stories. The Mesopotamian basin began to form, not just as a place, but as a process, a dialogue between land and water, erosion and renewal, flood and fertility. The rivers themselves were never still. Geologists estimate that in the early Holocene, the Tigris and Euphrates flowed with greater irregularity, especially during the spring thaw. Their paths diverged wildly from year to year, sometimes cutting new channels miles apart, sometimes reuniting like estranged siblings only to part again. This unpredictable dance left behind thick, fertile deposits, layers of silt, clay, and mineral-rich mud up to 4 meters deep in some regions. Even now, core samples taken near Tel al-Ubaid reveal alternating bands of wet and dry periods, each a line in Earth's forgotten journal. Sediment analysis suggests that many of the ancient settlements we'll later explore, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, rose on ground first laid down by floods around 6000 BCE. But at this stage in our story, there were no temples, no walls, no names, only low mounds of land emerging above seasonal waters, grassy ridges where early families might pause, forage, and move again. Imagine standing there, not in a city, but in a place that does not yet know cities are possible. To the east, marshes stretch endlessly, shimmering under a pale sky. To the west, wind sweeps across gravel plains that will one day be paved into courtyards. You might hear the flutter of birds, the murmur of reed beds in the wind, the lapping of river water against mud banks. But no language, no prayer, just the pulse of the earth, preparing itself. Take a breath. Let that stillness settle. We're walking backward through memory now, into a time before memory was written down. Archaeologists speak of this period not through monuments, but through micro-layers. Charcoal flecks in ancient hearth pits near Chogamami, obsidian flakes scattered along the Zagros foothills, spindle whorls carved from limestone found in Samara. These are not ruins of empires. They are whispers of families, communities moving with the seasons, living in circular huts built from packed mud and reed, sharing knowledge not through script, but through story and gesture. and still, they marked things. Near Yarmo, on the edge of the Zagros Range, a polished stone figurine was uncovered, no more than 9 centimeters tall. Carved around 6,500 BCE, its rounded form suggests a woman, or a goddess, or perhaps both. Its purpose remains debated. Fertility symbol, ancestral talisman, a teaching tool for future generations? The answer is incomplete. But the act of shaping, meaning from stone, even then, had already begun. The climate shaped more than land. It shaped belief. From 8,000 to 4,000 BCE, the climate in southern Mesopotamia shifted toward drier cycles. Monsoonal rains diminished. Seasonal flooding became more vital. Communities began to settle longer, not just following the rivers, but relying on them. The earliest irrigation systems emerged, simple channels etched by hand, guiding water toward barley fields and date palms. Where once people moved through landscapes, now they began to shape them in return. Sediment cores near ancient Eridu show early signs of controlled flooding as early as 5,200 BCE. Not just natural cycles, but deliberate redirection. These were not yet the Anunnaki cities, but they were the seeds sown in soil that remembered every flood and forgave each drought. And through all this, silence. Not silence as emptiness, but silence as potential. There were no written records yet, only the rustle of reeds, the echo of footsteps on packed clay, the quiet repetition of daily survival. No names for stars, but stars still moved. No word for gods, but forces were felt in the wind, in birth, in flood, in fire. The divine was not yet spoken, but it was sensed. Somewhere between 7,000 and 4,500 BCE, humans began pressing symbols into tokens. Small at first, round or cylindrical, carved with simple notches. A record of trade, of debt, of offering. By the time we reach the cities, these symbols will evolve into cuneiform, into stories. But here, in the silence before cities, meaning is still soft, still forming. So, what kind of world did the Anunnaki enter, if they entered at all? It was a world of patient shaping, a land of slow floods and long memory, a place where rivers braided themselves into myth before myths had names. And from this trembling, fertile basin, a civilization would rise, one that believed its gods once walked among them, one that would later ask, why did those gods leave? But that question belongs to a later tablet. For now, we remain here, in the cradle before the breath, in the mud before the monument, in the stillness before the voice. Next, we begin to feel the stirrings of story and of structure. The first signs that something is about to emerge. When the first human eyes turned upward in wonder, it was not the vastness that frightened them, but the order. The stars did not flicker randomly. They returned again and again in their seasons and patterns, faithful as floods. Constellations reappeared in the same positions. The moon waxed and waned with quiet discipline, and the sun, though it vanished into darkness each night, always returned, tracing its arc without failure. For early humans, this reliability didn't suggest chance. It suggested intention. And so, above the reeds and rivers, above the campfires and shelters, a new layer of meaning began to form. The sky was no longer just ceiling. It became council, calendar, cathedral. The first belief systems were not built in temples. They were built in patterns. Long before writing, long before gods had names, early humans began assigning meaning to what they saw above. Proto-religious behavior, as identified by archaeologists and anthropologists, includes burial practices, ritual deposits, and, critically, alignment with celestial cycles. As early as 10,000 BCE, sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey show structures oriented towards significant stellar and solar events. These megalithic enclosures, carved with animals and abstract symbols, do not seem residential. They seem devotional, and their placement, especially Enclosure D, suggests careful tracking of Sirius, the dog star, as it reappeared in the pre-dawn sky each summer. Why track Sirius? In Egypt, it would later herald the flooding of the Nile. In Mesopotamia, its timing aligned with planting and harvest. But even before agriculture, humans noticed. They didn't just survive the night, they read it. Somewhere between 6,000 and 4,000 BCE, a shift occurred, not only in observation, but in interpretation. Celestial bodies were no longer just signs. They were personalities, agents, deities. The Sumerians, by the 3rd millennium BCE, had already assigned names and roles to many skybound phenomena. Utu was the sun, Nana the moon, Inanna the planet Venus. These were not abstract metaphors. They were forces with will, desire, and relationship. Utu judged the deeds of mortals. Nana governed cycles of birth and rebirth. Inanna shined with power that was both nurturing and dangerous. Why did they place their gods above, not around or beneath? Perhaps the answer lies in distance. The sky was unreachable, which meant it was unchallengeable. It moved, but never touched. It ruled, but never bled. While the earth changed, cracked, flooded, the stars held steady. That unreachability inspired awe, and awe shaped hierarchy. Gods did not live among reeds and clay. They lived above the storms that drowned cities. There's a figurine from the Ubaid period, dated to around 5000 BCE, unearthed near Eridu. It depicts a humanoid form with exaggerated eyes, wide, upward-facing, as if fixed on something far beyond its maker's reach. Scholars debate its purpose. Fertility idol, spirit effigy, perhaps, but its gaze tells its own story, not downward, not inward, upward. It's not the only one. In northern Mesopotamia, clay tablets from the late Uruk period show star-like motifs drawn with deliberate geometry, intersecting lines, circles, dots arranged in repeating sequences. They are too organized to be decorative, and too consistent across sites to be coincidence. These may have been the earliest attempts to map the heavens, or at least to claim some portion of its rhythm for human use. Because that's what followed next, ritual. By the time we reach 3000 BCE, observation had become obligation. Temples across Sumer were oriented with precision. The ziggurat of Ur, for example, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was constructed on a platform precisely aligned with lunar rise points during key festivals. Its base, measuring roughly 64 by 46 meters, was built with baked bricks bonded by bitumen, engineered to support rituals that mirrored the heavens. Why go to such lengths? Because the sky wasn't just a clock. It was a courtroom. Its cycles were read as signs of favor or discontent. A solar eclipse wasn't just an event. It was an omen. The absence of Venus from the morning sky, a warning. And so, the priests became watchers, not of crops or trade, but of divine mood. The first astronomers were theologians. Pause here. If you're lying in bed now, eyes closed, imagine yourself on a flat Mesopotamian roof. The air is dry. The wind carries dust and heat. And above you, stars so sharp they seem carved into the black. You don't yet know the names of constellations, but you feel they are watching. This reverence shaped society. Kings claimed divine lineage not through earthly strength, but through celestial favor. Records from the city of Kish describe rulers who ascended under the sign of the lion star. In Nippur, ritual texts directed the timing of marriages, harvests, and even warfare based on planetary alignments. Sky dictated rhythm. Rhythm became law, and within that structure, comfort. For ancient humans, the heavens brought coherence. When the earth trembled, as it did often, the stars remained. When floods erased fields, Orion still hunted across the sky. They were not just lights, they were continuity. So, when we speak of the Anunnaki descending from the heavens, we must understand what the sky meant. It was order in a chaotic world. It was permanence above impermanence. And it was the first canvas onto which humans projected fear, hope, and story. Before, gods had names. They had positions. Before temples were built, the stars were read. And before cities breathed, humanity looked up and found meaning in the silence. Next, we begin to trace the first steps in clay, the emergence of structure, record, and the sacred bones of civilization. Across the floodplain where Sumer would one day rise, the land once whispered in green, not in monuments or marketplaces, but in rustling reeds and migrating herds, in dragonflies dancing above pooled water, and in quiet trails left by animals following the same rhythms each season. The southern basin of Mesopotamia, before writing, before kings, was not a desert. It was alive, and it moved in cycles. Each spring, the Tigris and Euphrates spilled from their banks, not with the violence of destruction, but with the patience of return. They brought silt, renewal, and restlessness. Then they withdrew, leaving behind pools, damp meadows, and fields lined with fresh clay. This was the rhythm that governed early human life, not clocks or laws, but the moods of the rivers. Where cities would later rise in brick and bronze, there were once reed beds stretching to the horizon, herons nesting in silence, and fish darting through flooded shallows beneath a sky so wide it swallowed sound. The earliest settlements were not built, they were placed. Tel el-Weli, dating to roughly 6,200 BCE, sits atop a natural rise, not far from the later city of Lagash. It wasn't a city, not yet. It was a cluster of dwellings made from hand-packed mud, their walls curved by the softness of human intention. Archaeologists found no fortifications, no palaces, only small hearths, broken tools, and signs of domestic rhythm, fish bones, date pits, crushed shells. And yet, the placement mattered, slightly elevated above the marsh, close enough to water for trade and sustenance, but safe from seasonal overflows. These were not random choices. They were environmental readings, human decisions made in dialogue with landscape. Walking through the remains of this world, you feel absence more than structure. There are no inscriptions, no statues, only soil layers, sediment bands, and pollen trapped in ancient mud. But these tell stories too. Palynological analysis from cores near Tel al-Hiba shows a dominance of willow, tamarisk, and papyrus, flora that thrive in riparian zones. Their presence suggests a wetland ecology far more expansive than what exists today. Combined with fish scale patterns and mollusk shells found in nearby mounds, it becomes clear these early people lived in a world shaped by water. They moved with it, not against it. Imagine standing at the edge of an early reed village. It's early morning, mist clings low, the marsh trembles with life. You hear frogs, their croaks rhythmic like breath. A distant splash, perhaps a boar. The air is warm, but soft. The scent is not floral, but earthy, brackish, alive. Somewhere, a child drops a hand-woven basket into the current, waiting for fish to swim inside. There are no kings here, no gods yet written, only families, listening to the land. Take a breath, let yourself arrive in that world. No roads, no war, just pattern, season, return. This pre-urban life was fragile, but resilient. Tools found at Ubaid period sites, sickles made from baked clay with flint inlays, show adaptations to harvest reed stalks and grain grasses. Fish traps woven from dried palm fibers still leave impressions in excavation layers. There is elegance here, not in excess, but in calibration. Every action, planting, hunting, gathering, was guided by environmental response. Even their dwellings mirrored the marsh. The foundations of early structures often followed circular or semi-oval designs, shaped not by architectural ambition, but by the flow of water and wind. They were cool in summer, quick to repair after flood, and always temporary enough to move with need. Civilization in these moments was not invented, it was invited. Why does this matter? Because the world that birthed Sumer was not waiting in silence. It was preparing through complexity. The adaptability required to live in marshlands forged behaviors, seasonal awareness, water management, storage planning, that would later support irrigation systems and temple economies. The skills learned by children gathering bulrushes became the engineering blueprints for canal gates. The rhythms of fishing tides became lunar calendars. The collaborative necessity of surviving floods became the political instinct to centralize control when waters rose too high. Nature, in its gradual offerings, shaped the minds that would later shape gods. Scholars often speak of environmental determinism, the idea that landscapes push civilizations toward certain forms. In Mesopotamia's case, the wetlands did more than that. They asked humans to slow down, to listen, to endure rhythms longer than memory. And so they built patience, not just shelters or baskets, but patience itself. Patience that would later allow a people to record history, line by line, on clay that took days to dry. Patience that built ziggurats one brick at a time, with hands that had once harvested rushes for walls. Before cities came mud, before empires came fish and wind and flood. This is the world that quietly offered its body to the Sumerians, not as conquest, but as collaboration. We forget that civilizations do not always rise with drums. Sometimes they drift in on morning mist and settle like silt. The Anunnaki would later be said to shape the world. But first, the world shaped the people who would name them. And next, we begin to trace those first names, carved not into legend, but into clay. The earliest human impressions, when meaning first touched earth. Beneath the floors of ancient temples, in storerooms sealed by collapse and time, archaeologists have uncovered the earliest attempts humanity ever made to hold memory still. Before writing became language, before tablets recorded kings and battles, there were simple marks pressed into wet clay. Small, utilitarian, almost shy in their intention. Yet these impressions, no more than lines, wedges, and circles, were the beginning of something civilization had never known before. The ability to preserve thought beyond the breath that spoke it. When the first proto-writing appeared around 3400 BCE in the region of Uruk, it wasn't poetry or myth. It was accounting, grain tallies, herd inventories, lists of laborers assigned to irrigation dikes. These earliest tablets, often no larger than your palm, were shaped from river mud and dried in the sun. Archaeologists identify them as proto-cuneiform, the transitional system between symbolic counters and true script. They contain around 1,500 distinct signs, many pictorial, a sheaf of barley, a jar of oil, a human head. Nothing abstract, nothing divine, just life, measured. And yet, in these quiet beginnings, something extraordinary waited beneath the surface. Over the next centuries, symbols evolved from pictures into concepts. A barley stalk no longer meant barley itself. It could signify a ration, an offering, or even a deity associated with agriculture. The marks became sharper. Wedges replaced curves. Reed styluses cut deeper into the clay, leaving the impression that would define Mesopotamian writing for 2,000 years. Cuneiform. Its earliest examples appear on tablets excavated from the Iana district in Uruk. Temple storage rooms burned and rebuilt countless times between 3,300 and 3000 BCE. Many tablets were preserved accidentally by fire. Baked clay survives better than sun-dried. Some show impressions made hurriedly, lines crooked, symbols overlapping. These are the voices of scribes learning a new art, an art that turned mud into memory. Imagine the sound, a reed pressed into clay, a soft click, almost like rain, a whisper you can still hear if you hold a tablet close. But something remarkable happened when administration met imagination. As cities grew and temple economies expanded, writing became more than bookkeeping. Scribes began to record offerings to deities, hymns recited during festivals, genealogies of kings. Administrative tablets became narrative tablets, a shift we can trace layer by layer in archives at Shuruppak, Nippur, and Eridu. By 2600 BCE, the first mythic stories appear. They are brief, fragmented, but unmistakable. A few lines invoking Inanna's descent, a description of Enki arranging the world's elements, a list of Mi, divine powers that shape civilization. These early myths were not literature yet. They were reminders, ritual scripts, sacred templates ensuring ceremonies happened in the correct order. But then came story. Pause with me for a moment. If you're listening while resting, let your breath slow. Imagine a dim room lit by oil lamps, clay shelves lined with tablets, and a scribe leaning forward, stylus poised. Now, picture his task. He isn't just copying numbers, he is preserving worlds. One of the most significant finds in this transformation came from the ancient city of Nippur, the theological heart of Sumer. In 1893, during the University of Pennsylvania expedition, archaeologists uncovered a chamber filled with more than 7,000 broken tablets. Some belonged to temple records, others to scribal schools. But among them were fragments of myths historians had never seen before. A line describing the creation of humankind from clay mixed with divine essence. A lament mourning the destruction of a city by heavenly decree. A tale of gods debating the fate of humans who grew too numerous and too noisy. These weren't administrative documents anymore. They were cosmologies. They explained not just what happened in the world, but why. Cuneiform had become a bridge, linking daily life with divine imagination. This shift carried reverence. To record a divine story was not simply to write, it was to honor. When a scribe pressed his stylus into clay, he participated in a sacred act. Texts like the Kesh Temple hymn describe scribal work as guided by Nisaba, the goddess of writing and wisdom. Each tablet, once completed, was often dried near temple walls, placed in archives, or buried ceremonially beneath new structures. Writing was not casual. It was devotional architecture. Even administrative texts retained this aura. A grain list written for the goddess Inanna was not simply accounting. It was evidence of care, fulfillment of obligation, confirmation of cosmic order. And from these obligations, narratives grew. The evolution from number to myth is visible not only in content, but also in layout. Tablets from the early dynastic period show columns divided by incised lines, precursors to poetic stanzas. Mythic texts often include repeated phrases, mirrored structures, and parallel imagery. These aren't accidents. They are memory aids, performance cues for priests and storytellers. In some temple libraries, such as those excavated at ancient Adab, tablets were stored by theme, hymns on one shelf, ritual instructions on another, myths on a third. This suggests not just writing, but curation. People were beginning to think of stories as objects worth preserving. What makes these discoveries powerful is not the grandeur of their content, but the intimacy of their origins. Civilization did not learn to write myths first. It learned to write rations, and from those rations emerged worlds filled with gods, wars, creation, destruction, and cosmic law. The first whisper in clay became the first breath of literature, and with each new line, humanity stepped further into self-awareness. Next, we follow that breath into the rise of cities, when symbols became systems and memory became monument. When the first true cities emerged across southern Mesopotamia, they did not rise randomly. They appeared with the deliberate spacing of stars. Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, three of the oldest urban centers on Earth, formed a kind of sacred triangle across the alluvial plain, each one dedicated to a different divine presence, each one growing around a temple that acted as both heart and horizon. From above, if one could have looked down around 3200 BCE, the pattern would have seemed intentional, as though humans were arranging their world to mirror something glittering above them. And maybe that was the point. The Sumerians didn't merely build cities, they built reflections. Uruk, often considered the world's first true metropolis, expanded across nearly 250 hectares at its height. Archaeological surveys reveal dense clusters of homes, workshops, ceremonial courts, and administrative complexes. But its defining feature was the Iyana district, a monumental ensemble of temples dedicated to Inanna. These structures, many built atop layers of earlier platforms, rose above the city like stepped mountains. Their facades were covered in cone mosaics, thousands of clay cones pressed into mud brick to create shimmering patterns that caught the shifting sun. Eridu, older still, carried a different tone. Excavations show at least 17 levels of temples, built one atop another, stretching back to around 5000 BCE. Each reconstruction expanded the platform beneath it, each generation lifting Enki's temple slightly higher, as though trying to reach a story remembered but not fully seen. Eridu's sacred mound, though smaller than later ziggurats, established the architectural grammar that would define Sumer's spiritual landscape. And then there was Nippur, the theological capital of Sumer, the city of Enlil. If Uruk was imagination and Eridu was origin, Nippur was authority. Kingship, according to Sumerian belief, did not reside permanently in any city. It descended from heaven into Nippur, and from there it was granted to whoever ruled the land. Excavations at Nippur's temple complex reveal administrative tablets, offerings, hymns, and ritual objects dating back thousands of years. Its ziggurat, though now eroded, once stood as a monumental axis linking earth to sky. These were not just settlements. They were cosmological statements. Ziggurats emerged as the physical embodiment of this worldview. Rising in stepped terraces, built from millions of mud bricks, these structures stood as bridges, links between the mortal plane and the realm of gods. Their cores were solid baked clay, often reinforced with bitumen, and their outer layers gleamed white with fired bricks. The ziggurat of Ur, reconstructed by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, measured roughly 64 by 46 meters at its base and climbed more than 20 meters high, even in its earliest phase. Its stairways aligned with cardinal directions. Its upper platform held a sanctuary accessible only to priests. To climb a ziggurat was not simply to ascend a building, it was to move closer to the divine. And for people living in these early cities, that closeness defined society itself. Pause here. If you're resting, let your breath ease into your chest. Picture yourself standing at the foot of Ur's ziggurat at dawn. The bricks radiate warmth from yesterday's sun. A priest climbs slowly, unhurried, carrying an offering bowl. Below him, the city begins to wake, potters shaping clay, shepherds guiding flocks, scribes preparing tablets, all of it organized beneath the gaze of a god enshrined above. Urban life in Sumer was not merely practical, it was theological. Social organization centered around temples. The temple households controlled large tracts of agricultural land, managed herds, oversaw granaries, and employed skilled laborers. Priests acted as intermediaries, not just spiritually, but economically. Administrative tablets from Uruk and Lagash show rations distributed through temple stores, wages recorded for workers digging irrigation canals, and lists of livestock dedicated to rituals. Every transaction, every measure of barley, every craft produced within city walls existed within a divine framework. To give to the temple was to maintain cosmic balance. To receive from the temple was to be folded into divine order. Kingship itself grew from this structure. Early Sumerian rulers called themselves Ensi, stewards, rather than absolute monarchs. Their legitimacy came from ritual, not conquest. In Nippur, kings underwent ceremonial rites confirming their authority under Enlil. Without heavenly approval, political power was incomplete. Thus, gods were not distant. They were civic anchors. Archaeology supports this intertwining of the sacred and the urban. In Eridu's deepest layers, researchers found altars made of gypsum plaster surrounded by fish bones, evidence of ritual offerings. In Uruk, cylinder seals depict priests performing sacrifices beside temple platforms. In Nippur, more than 30,000 tablets have been recovered, many documenting temple activities, offerings, hymns, property management, and ceremonial timing determined by celestial cycles. Urban planning followed these spiritual priorities. Streets radiated outward from temples. Neighborhoods formed around craft specializations that served religious needs. Potters producing ritual vessels, metal workers shaping tools for sacrifice, and scribes copying hymns. Cities did not simply grow around temples. Temples grew the cities. The constellation-like arrangement of Sumerian cities wasn't accidental. It mirrored their cosmology. Each god governed different domains: water, sky, fertility, justice. and their cities served as earthly reflections of heavenly order. When people traveled between Uruk and Nippur, or from Eridu to Ur, they weren't just moving across land. They were moving across a map of divine influence. This pattern-shaped identity, a person from Ur belonged to the moon god Nana's domain. A person from Eridu lived under Enki's wisdom. A person from Nippur walked beneath Enlil's authority. The landscape itself became theological text. So when we later encounter stories of the Anunnaki departing, we must understand what was at stake. Their presence wasn't just mythic, it was civic, architectural, agricultural, administrative. Their absence would have felt like a crack in the sky, a fracture in the very logic that held society together. But we are not there yet. For now, we stand in a world newly formed, where cities rise like constellations across the plains, and gods step down into brick and ceremony. Next, we move into the myths themselves, the evolving stories that shaped how people understood divine presence and divine withdrawal. When archaeologists first translated certain cuneiform fragments from ancient Nippur, Uruk, and Sipar, they found lines that did not fit comfortably within the usual rhythms of Sumerian devotion. Instead of praise, or hymns, or ritual instructions, these tablets carried a tension almost physical in its presence. They described the gods not as serene overseers, but as unsettled, strained, even weary. The language was measured, but unmistakable. Something in the world of humans had begun to trouble the divine. Several passages from the Atrahasis tradition stand at the center of this unease. In them, the younger gods are tasked with laboring for the older ones, digging canals, maintaining fields, and shaping the infrastructure that early humans would later inherit. But dissatisfaction brews. The texts describe murmuring, discontent, and eventually revolt, and when humans are later introduced into the narrative, they become both solution and problem, created to perform the labor. The gods no longer wish to carry, yet growing so numerous and noisy that their presence becomes unbearable. It is in those lines that scholars first notice something unusual. The dissatisfaction belonged not only to mortals, it echoed in the heavens. The Atrahasis narrative, recorded in versions dating from around 1700 BCE, but clearly based on older Sumerian traditions, contains several troubling refrains. One passage describes humanity's noise, rising like a storm, preventing Enlil from resting. Another speaks of imbalance in the natural order, overpopulation, cities expanding, fields stretching beyond traditional boundaries, upsetting cosmic equilibrium. These descriptions, though mythic, parallel real environmental data. Sediment cores from southern Mesopotamia show rapid expansion of irrigation networks around 2400 to 2200 BCE. Population density increased. Forests in the north were cut for timber and fuel. The land strained. Flood patterns changed. And whether myth mirrored fact or fact recast itself as myth, the stories reflect a worldview in which human activity had begun to lean against cosmic limits. Some tablets from Shurupak go further, recording laments that describe the gods withdrawing counsel or turning their faces away. The language is subtle. The Sumerians rarely wrote directly of abandonment, but the implications unsettled researchers. In these lines, the Anunnaki do not destroy humanity out of rage. They retreat out of exhaustion, or disappointment, or some deeper conflict not explicitly named. Imagine sitting with one of these clay fragments in your hands. It's small, the size of a deck of cards, but heavy with silt and history. The surface is scratched, broken at the edges. The wedges are shallow in some places, deep in others. A scribe writing quickly, perhaps, trying to preserve a story that was already slipping through memory. You can almost see him pausing, stylus hovering, unsure whether to record divine displeasure so plainly. Take a breath. Let that weight settle in your chest. These tablets weren't written for us, yet they reached us anyway. What troubles scholars most is not a single passage, but the recurring pattern, across independent sites, written many generations apart. The same themes emerge: divine discomfort, human expansion framed as imbalance, councils among the gods marked by disagreement, withdrawal described as protective rather than punitive. One fragment from Nippur describes gods descending no longer during festivals, their seats in the temple kept in readiness, but unused. Another from Uruk details ritual procedures for invoking a deity who has gone to his distant place. These lines do not narrate destruction, they narrate absence. The silence is the message. The Atrahasis flood story is often compared to the later version in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the earlier text is more candid about motive. The flood is not only cleansing, it is a response to systemic strain. After humanity becomes too populous, the gods debate solutions. Their disagreement feels startlingly administrative. Some advocate plague, others famine. Finally, the flood becomes the chosen reset. But embedded between these drastic measures is another detail rarely highlighted. After the flood, the gods limit human lifespan and fertility, not as punishment, as equilibrium, a measured correction, not annihilation. This is why some researchers interpret these texts as indicators of divine withdrawal rather than destruction. The gods reduce their involvement, adjust their proximity, establish boundaries that place more responsibility on humans. Civilization grows, but the divine steps back, a cosmic parent loosening its grasp. There is another layer, found not in narrative tablets, but in ritual ones. At several temple sites, including those in Lagash and Nippur, archaeologists recovered instructions for ceremonies meant to restore balance between heaven and earth. These involve offerings, water libations, and symbolic acts to call back divine attention. Such rituals only make sense if people felt that attention drifting away. In one particularly striking tablet, a scribe writes, "The doors of the sky are shut. The river of counsel runs thin. It is not despair. It is resignation, a recognition that something had changed." So why did some texts suggest departure rather than vengeance? Because to the Sumerians, withdrawal was more frightening than wrath. Wrath implied relationship, gods reacting to human behavior. Withdrawal implied indifference, a world left to its own devices, a system once tended, now left untended. And yet, in that absence, humanity stepped forward, built cities, developed law, learned agriculture, trade, astronomy. Some scholars argue the myths encode this transition, from divine governance to human responsibility. Others believe stories may preserve cultural memory of real, catastrophic events reinterpreted as divine retreat. Both readings matter. Both remain incomplete. As we move forward, keep this idea with you. The first cracks in the relationship between gods and humans did not appear in storms or wars. They appeared in quiet lines of clay, in murmurs, in unease. Next, we step from text into experience, into the world where gods and mortals once moved side by side, and where that closeness began to shift. There was a time, at least in the imagination of ancient Sumer, when the boundary between heaven and earth felt thin, almost permeable. Daily life unfolded beneath the impression that gods were not distant rulers, but near companions, watching from temple terraces, listening from behind carved doors, shaping the rhythm of each day. In cities like Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, devotion wasn't a performance, it was participation, a shared maintenance of cosmic order where humans played their part and the gods, in return, offered stability. Imagine morning light falling across a temple courtyard. Workers arrive with baskets of barley, pots of fresh beer, bundles of reeds for burning. These aren't donations, the way we might understand them today. They are provisions, sustenance for divine households that were believed to function much like human ones. Each god had a kitchen, a storehouse, attendants, and rituals marking when meals were presented. The smoke rising from sacred hearths wasn't symbolic alone. It was nourishment, an offering carried upward to sustain a presence too large for human sight. And at the center of this daily choreography stood the priesthood, interpreters, caretakers, bridge keepers between worlds. Priests were not simply religious figures. They were administrators, calendar keepers, economists, healers, and astronomers. A priest might oversee irrigation schedules one moment, then read the alignment of Venus the next. They guided festivals, interpreted omens, and ensured offerings were performed correctly so that the delicate balance known as me, the divine decrees structuring existence, remained intact. Their authority came not from personal power, but from proximity. They were believed to move closer to the gods than ordinary people could, climbing temple stairs, entering sanctuaries, speaking invocations written on tablets kept in sealed chambers. When a priest approached the statue of a deity, it wasn't stone he addressed, it was presence. The figure served as a locus of divine attention, a point where the unseen world touched the material one. To live in these cities was to depend on that connection and to trust that the priests could maintain it. Pause for a breath. Let your shoulders settle where they are. Picture the quiet that must have filled those early sanctuaries. Oil lamps flickering against gypsum-plastered walls. The scent of incense, cedar, myrrh, sometimes date resin. The soft steps of attendants carrying fresh water to wash the altar stones. Nothing rushed, nothing hurried. Everything done with the weight of cosmic meaning. Daily devotion extended beyond temple walls. Households kept small shrines with clay figurines, offering meals in miniature. Breadcrumbs, dates, drops of beer. Farmers prayed before opening irrigation channels, asking Enki for favorable currents. Parents whispered blessings to Nana when the moon rose over rooftops. Travelers placed tokens in wayside niches, calling upon Inanna for protection. To the Sumerians, the gods were not abstract forces. They were participants, present, tangible in the order of seasons, the steadiness of the rivers, the prosperity of fields, the beating of one's own heart. This intimacy came with responsibility. If humans neglected ritual, the world could tilt off balance. If the gods withdrew, even briefly, irrigation plans failed, storms arrived without pattern, illness spread. The reliance was mutual but asymmetrical. Humans depended far more on divine presence than the gods depended on them. And that dependence shaped the earliest economies. Temple complexes functioned as the first large-scale organizational systems. They managed farmland, distributed food rations, stored surplus grain in vaulted rooms built from mud brick and palm timber. Workers received wages in barley or copper, recorded on clay tablets that tracked every measure. In many cities, half the population worked on temple lands, herders tending temple livestock, fishermen supplying temple kitchens, potters crafting ritual vessels. Everything had a divine recipient. Everything was part of a cosmic ledger. And at the top of that system stood the gods, not merely honored, but essential. Without their favor, the very logic of society collapsed. This is why the notion of gods walking among mortals wasn't just comforting, it was necessary. The presence of divinity stabilized the fragile world of early urban life. Festivals reaffirmed cosmic connection. Statues were washed, dressed, seated in boats during river processions. People could watch their god move through the city. They could see the relationship enacted. In moments like these, separation between mortal and divine felt thin. But such intimacy carries weight, and expectation, and fear of change. When later texts describe gods withdrawing or becoming silent, it isn't framed as mere absence. It represents the loss of an entire structure of meaning, a collapse not only of worship, but of dependence. Yet, in this golden period, before tension or departure, people believed the gods breathed through their cities, and they built their days around that breath. Next, we'll explore how that closeness, that dependence, interacted with the heavens as ancient astronomers sought to understand not only the will of the gods, but the patterns that revealed their presence. Across the plains of ancient Mesopotamia, monumental structures rose slowly, deliberately, as if shaped not only by human hands, but by collective longing. These were the ziggurats, stepped mountains built where no mountains stood, vast platforms of mud brick that lifted temples toward the sky. In cities like Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, their outlines dominated the horizon, visible from kilometers away. They were practical structures in one sense, but far more than that in every way that mattered. A ziggurat was an emotional declaration, a city's way of saying, "We remember who we belong to." Its very shape carried meaning. The Sumerians believed the universe was layered, the domains of earth, sky, and the unseen realm above the heavens. By raising a sacred platform in stepped stages, people mirrored these layers physically. Each terrace symbolized ascent, not just upward movement, but nearness. Nearness to guidance, to blessing, to the eyes of the divine. The summit shrine, often tiny compared to the mass below, acted as a hinge point between mortal and celestial spaces. The geometry of these structures was never random. Their corners aligned with cardinal directions. Their stairways corresponded to ritual processions timed with solstice sunrises or particular lunar phases. Even the slope ratios carried intention, allowing priests to ascend without turning sideways, a small but meaningful gesture that preserved ritual dignity. Consider the ziggurat of Ur, commissioned by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE. Its base measured roughly 64 by 46 meters, a rectangle so precise that modern surveys show deviations of only a few centimeters despite thousands of years of erosion. The core was built from millions of mud bricks, each hand-molded, sun-dried, and carried by laborers who understood that every brick was not just material. It was devotion. Its facade was strengthened with baked bricks set in bitumen mortar, a process that required controlled kilns and steady fuel supplies. To build a di, structure of such scale wasn't merely engineering, it was choreography, and labor, here, was worship. Construction seasons often coincided with post-harvest months, when agricultural demands eased and communities could devote time to temple projects. Entire neighborhoods participated, potters shaping bricks, shepherds bringing wool for ropes, fishermen delivering reeds used to bind scaffolding. Children carried water, elders offered blessings. Every person's effort mattered because the structure embodied the collective spiritual life of the city. Through building, they belonged. Pause a moment. If your body has begun to settle deeper into your bed, allow it. Imagine the feel of a warm brick in your hands, rough, gritty, smelling faintly of earth baked in sun. Imagine passing it to the person beside you, part of a human chain stretching up a rising terrace. No urgency, only rhythm. Building wasn't just about height, it was about harmony. Sacred geometry extended beyond the ziggurat itself. Temple courtyards were proportioned using ratios that repeated across cities, suggesting a shared architectural vocabulary rooted in cosmology. A common pattern involved dividing space into thirds, a symbolic echo of heaven, earth, and the waters below. Doorways framed processional lines. Ramps guided the movement of priests during rituals. And at dawn or dusk, shadows cast by the ziggurat's terraces fell in shapes that mirrored celestial events important to the ritual calendar. It is possible that such precision created not only beauty, but reassurance. In a world where floods, disease, and conflict could unravel a community's stability, architecture offered permanence, a visible anchor when the invisible felt uncertain. The effort invested in these structures was astonishing. Mud brick, the primary material, erodes quickly in rain. That means every ziggurat required constant repair, annual replastering, refacing bricks, repainting. This, maintenance, was its own ritual, a reaffirmation of commitment, a reminder that reverence was not static. It needed tending, just like fields or families. Through this tending, the community reaffirmed itself. Archaeological evidence shows that construction projects often spanned generations. A child might help carry water for mortar, years later help lift bricks, and as an elder oversee repairs. That continuity stitched identity into the very walls. People didn't simply live near temples, they grew alongside them. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period depict scenes of rulers presenting baskets of bricks to deities, a symbolic act showing kingship as service, not entitlement. Relief carvings from Uruk show processions carrying foundation pegs, offerings, and ceremonial tools. These images weren't propaganda. They were declarations that a city's strength flowed from shared devotion, not military might alone. The gods, in turn, were believed to dwell among these structures. A temple atop a ziggurat wasn't merely symbolic space, it was presence. When the deity statue was carried into the shrine at dawn or dusk, people believed the god returned physically to the city. The architecture made that return possible. So when we think of Sumer's monumental buildings, we shouldn't see only brick and engineering. We should see longing, cooperation, meaning layered over meaning. We should see thousands of hands shaping not just structures, but story. These were not monuments to power. They were monuments to relationship. And in that relationship, between gods and mortals, between earth and sky, the first fractures would later appear. But not yet. For now, the ziggurats still stand bright with fresh plaster, the courtyards filled with morning offerings, and communities unified by the simple, ancient belief that building upward was a way of reaching outward. Next, we step into the rhythm of daily devotion, the lived experience, of ordinary people under the wide, watchful sky. At dawn in ancient Sumer, ordinary life unfolded with a quiet sense of choreography, not because the people moved together by habit, but because they believed their days were woven into a divine pattern. Farming, cooking, weaving, parenting, everything carried a sacred undertone. Each action was part of a rhythm older than any single family, older even than the cities themselves. Life was ordinary, yes, but always lived beneath extraordinary beliefs. When farmers stepped onto their fields, they didn't simply examine soil or check irrigation channels. They looked first to the sky, the position of the moon, the brightness of Venus at dawn, the tone of the wind at sunrise. All were read as signs of a god's shifting attention. Barley planting aligned with the phases of Nana, the moon god. Harvest festivals tied their timing to Utu, the sun god, whose steady arc across the horizon marked the proper moments for reaping. People believed that neglecting these rhythms risked more than agricultural failure. It risked cosmic imbalance. And so, the day began not with tools, but with awareness. Festivals wove celestial cycles into communal memory. The Akitu, the New Year festival, aligned with the spring equinox, when light and darkness balanced. During these celebrations, rulers reaffirmed their legitimacy by reenacting myths of divine renewal. Families prepared offerings, cleaned household shrines, and exchanged small gifts. Children wore newly woven garments dyed with indigo or safflower, believing fresh cloth invited fresh blessing. Other festivals followed the movements of planets. Inanna's celebrated descent into and return from the underworld mirrored the disappearance and reappearance of Venus in the sky. When the bright star returned to its morning position, entire cities rejoiced. Processions wound through streets. Drums echoed against mud brick walls. Statues of the goddess were carried past cheering crowds. People believed that the sky was speaking, telling them when grief had passed, when hope had returned, when the world breathed in harmony once more. The celestial was not distant. It was a clock, a calendar, a voice. Pause here. Let your breath ease and soften. Imagine drifting into sleep while a distant festival drum fades in the night air. That mix of reverence and celebration. That feeling of belonging in a world filled with invisible company. That's the rhythm Sumerians lived inside every day. Family life unfolded within this theological framework. Births were believed to be watched over by Ninhursag, the mother goddess. Infants received protective amulets made of shell or copper, tied with flax cords. Before meals, families whispered thanks to the household deity, whose small clay figurine sat in a niche near the hearth. Even mundane acts carried ritual weight. Sweeping the floor at night was said to clear the path for good dreams. Pouring out, the final sip of beer honored ancestors who lingered in memory. Marriage contracts included invocations to divine witnesses. Parents taught children not just practical skills, weaving, grinding grain, tending herds, but also the stories explaining why these skills mattered in cosmic balance. A child didn't just learn to irrigate a field, they learned that guided water honored Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. A child didn't just learn to bake bread, they learned that bread fed not only the living, but also the gods. Life was woven into a tapestry of meanings, each thread held in place by devotion. Fear and gratitude existed side by side. People feared drought because it might signal withdrawal of divine favor. They feared eclipses, sudden, terrifying erasures of the sun, interpreted as warnings of royal danger or approaching disaster. They feared illness, understood not as random misfortune, but as a message carried through the body. Yet gratitude shaped them just as deeply. Gratitude for a child's safe birth, gratitude for the return of rains, gratitude for a good harvest recorded on clay tablets for temple granaries. In clay archives, scribes preserved hymns overflowing with thanks. To Enlil for steady winds, to Nana for lighting the night path, to Inanna for victory in conflict and fertility in the home. Gratitude softened fear, fear sharpened devotion. Together, these emotions created continuity, a feeling that each generation stood inside the same cosmic pattern as those before. Continuity was everything. A family's place in the divine order mattered more than wealth, more than status, more than individual ambition. The rhythm of sacred life promised that, as long as humans kept their obligations, the gods would keep theirs. And this is why later descriptions of divine withdrawal felt so devastating. If the rhythms were disrupted, if signs became silent, if temples no longer echoed with presence, then continuity itself threatened to break. But we're not in that moment yet. We're still in the world where offerings steam gently at dawn, where children laugh beneath temple walls, where festivals align with stars, and where every ordinary act carries extraordinary meaning. Next, we look upward once more, toward the sky that governed those rhythms, revealed divine moods, and shaped the oldest forms of human knowledge. When the people of ancient Mesopotamia lifted their eyes toward the night sky, they weren't simply looking at distant points of light. They believed they were reading a language, a script written across darkness, carrying messages from the divine. Every star, every wandering planet, every seasonal shift was part of an ongoing conversation between heaven and earth. And long before astronomy became a science, it was a form of prayer. In clay tablets excavated from Nineveh and Babylon, we find some of the earliest star catalogs dating as far back as the late 2nd millennium BCE. Lists of constellations were arranged in methodical order, grouped into 3 celestial paths: the path of Enlil in the north, the path of Anu in the center, and the path of Ea in the south. This division wasn't only observational, it reflected a cosmic hierarchy. The sky, like their society, was organized according to divine roles. To study it was to participate in a sacred structure. But star lists were only the beginning. Scholars working centuries ago, often priest astronomers, tracked the movements of planets with astonishing dedication. Venus, especially, received careful attention. Its disappearances and reappearances were recorded in sequences that spanned decades. These observations would later form the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, showing patterns accurate enough that modern astronomers have used them to refine historical chronologies. For the people who first recorded them, Venus wasn't a planet in orbit. It was Inanna, descending, vanishing, returning, carrying her story across the sky. Night after night, these observers sat on rooftops or temple platforms, marking tiny impressions into wet clay. Slow, deliberate. You can almost imagine the breath of the scribe forming small clouds in cooler months as he pressed each symbol. These records weren't meant only for data, they preserved relationship. Tracking the heavens was an act of faith. Let's pause for a breath, let your shoulders settle, let your eyes soften, and picture the dark sky above an unlit city, stars bright, sharp, steady. Silence deep enough that you could hear your own heartbeat. This was their laboratory, their sanctuary, their oldest classroom. From these early observations emerged innovations that shaped civilization itself. To manage agricultural cycles and ritual calendars, people needed reliable systems of timekeeping. They divided the year into 12 lunar months, then adjusted with intercalary months when necessary to keep the seasons aligned. The concept of a week, as we know it today, traces roots to their tracking of the 7 visible celestial bodies: the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. Each was tied to a deity. Each governed a day. Water clocks, clepsydras, allowed them to track hours at night. Shadow clocks complemented them during the day. Priests used these devices not only to time rituals, but to measure the rising and culmination of specific stars. Precision mattered. If a ritual aligned with the wrong moment, the communication with the divine could be weakened. And underneath all this was an assumption both gentle and powerful. The sky was speaking, and humans could listen. Even the constellations carried stories. The bull of heaven, the plow, the scorpion. These weren't arbitrary shapes drawn from imagination. They mirrored myths, agricultural tools, animals of symbolic importance. Constellations linked cosmic cycles to earthly life, reinforcing the belief that heaven and earth reflected one another. When a constellation rose just before dawn, people anticipated seasonal changes: flooding, planting, storm seasons, or the return of migratory animals. Knowledge and reverence intertwined. Planetary tracking grew increasingly sophisticated. Astronomers noticed retrograde motion, the strange backward path planets trace across the sky. Instead of confusion, it inspired interpretation. A planet reversing direction was treated as a shift in divine intention. Sometimes this meant warnings for kings, sometimes reassurance. Clay tablets record predictions, omens, and instructions for rituals meant to maintain balance in response to celestial signals. Science and spirituality were not separate currents. They were the same river flowing in 2 directions, one toward understanding, one toward devotion. Time itself became a dialogue. As priests observed stars crossing the meridian, they measured not just hours, but cosmic trust. As they recorded eclipses, they documented not just phenomena, but divine moods. As they built knowledge across generations, they preserved not just data, but continuity. And continuity anchored them. Because in a world vulnerable to floods, famine, and political upheaval, the sky was the one constant that could not be conquered. Even the gods, according to many myths, moved along the same celestial pathways humans observed. Their dwellings shifted with seasons. Their power waxed and waned like moonlight. Observing the sky meant understanding divine behavior, which is why, in later texts describing unrest among the gods, disruptions in expected celestial patterns carried more weight than ordinary omens. Something had changed. Something felt unstable. But for now, we remain in the era when calculations were steady, ritual timing precise, and the heavens still felt like a dependable text. Next, we'll walk into the heart of sacred cities, where devotion wasn't only lived, but built, embodied, and carried into stone by thousands of hands. When the night sky shifted in ways that felt unfamiliar, ancient Mesopotamians did not shrug or look away. They believed the heavens held the emotional pulse of the divine, and that any sudden change, any disruption of a familiar pattern signaled unrest in realms beyond human sight. The sky wasn't just a backdrop, it was a warning system, one that required unbroken attention. And as the first millennium BCE approached, clay tablets began to reflect something remarkable. a quiet rise in celestial anxiety. Eclipses, especially, were treated as messages of profound consequence. A solar eclipse turning daylight into cold twilight unsettled even seasoned astronomer priests. It was never interpreted as a simple alignment of celestial bodies. Instead, it suggested that a high-ranking deity had withdrawn protection or expressed displeasure. Scholars in the great cities, Assur, Babylon, and Uruk, recorded eclipse paths with astonishing precision. The hour it occurred, the region it darkened, the strength of its shadow. Each detail carried interpretive weight. If an eclipse began in the west, it was thought to threaten the king. If its darkness lingered unnaturally, it hinted at cosmic turmoil. They didn't ask, "What caused it?" They asked, "Who caused it, and why?" Let's pause a moment. Breathe once, slowly. Imagine the horizon dimming while people in reed-roofed homes step outside in a silence that feels heavier than ordinary darkness. For them, these moments weren't astronomical events. They were emotional interruptions in the relationship between heaven and earth. Comets, too, unsettled the ancients. Their bright, wandering tails appeared unpredictably, unlike stars whose movements were stable and comforting. One clay tablet from the 7th century BCE describes a star with a tail like a torch rushing across the sky. The scribe who wrote those lines didn't react with excitement. He reacted with worry. Comets were considered foreign presences, signs of gods traveling through unfamiliar paths or engaging in conflict beyond human comprehension. Their unpredictability symbolized divine instability. A comet that lingered too long might suggest disputes among celestial beings. One that appeared abruptly near a royal star could imply danger to kingship. And because comet sightings often coincided with droughts or political tensions, people grew increasingly sensitive to the sky's moods. Patterns that once felt steady began to feel unsettled. Astrological warnings became more elaborate during this period. Omen series like Enuma Anu and Lil compiled hundreds of celestial conditions, each tied to possible outcomes. If Mars rises dim, famine approaches. If Jupiter disappears behind cloud cover on a feast day, loyalty weakens. If Venus flickers unnaturally, the goddess is refusing offerings. These weren't superstitions in their eyes. They were diagnostics, attempts to read divine emotion the way a physician reads pulse or breath. Astronomers logged anomalies with growing concern. Strange retrograde motion, conjunctions occurring off expected schedules, sudden brightness fluctuations. Even when modern astronomy explains these events easily, the ancients perceived them differently, as disruptions in cosmic rhythm. And cosmic rhythm, to them, was covenant. When the rhythm faltered, trust faltered. Imagine living in a world where the emotional life of the gods was expressed through the sky. Every flicker carried meaning. Every shadow carried potential consequence. Communities responded to these perceived signs of instability with ritual precision. If an eclipse threatened royal safety, substitute kings were installed temporarily, symbolic figures who absorbed the omen's danger, while the true king remained hidden. After a set number of days, the substitute was released, and the threat was considered dispersed. Priests intensified offerings, burned fragrant resins, and recited calming hymns meant to steady the heavens. Diviners performed incense readings, watching how the smoke curled or hesitated. Temple astrologers worked through the night, cross-checking omens against older records. The goal wasn't to eliminate fear, it was to restore balance. In some cities, communities held communal laments when comets appeared, not out of despair, but out of solidarity with the divine realm. If the gods felt agitation, humans offered empathy. Rituals were reminders that cosmic relationships required tending, the same way ziggurats required constant resurfacing. By the time these omen lists grew thicker, some scribes began to note a more troubling pattern. The sky seemed to speak more urgently, more frequently, and with less clarity. One tablet describes the gods contending in their paths. Another mentions disorder in the station of the stars. These phrases don't match routine astronomical observation. They match anxiety. The people felt something shifting, not just in the heavens, but in the relationship between heavens and earth. This sense of cosmic restlessness would later color interpretations of divine withdrawal, shaping myths in which gods left not out of anger alone, but out of fear, confusion, or the aftermath of celestial conflict. But we're not there yet. Here, in this moment, we stand beneath a sky beginning to tremble. Next, we descend into what lies beneath that sky, the symbols, inscriptions, and hidden meanings that shaped how the ancients made sense of a world that no longer felt entirely stable. Across the mythic imagination of Mesopotamia, departure was never described plainly. Gods did not simply walk away. Instead, stories cloaked their distancing in metaphor. Floods that erased, gates that closed, silences that deepened. These metaphors were not literary flourishes. They were emotional maps, designed to help people interpret what it meant to feel the divine slipping out of reach. And when you read the oldest accounts, especially those etched into clay from Nippur or Ur, you sense something else beneath the surface. A quiet recognition that relationships between gods and humans had grown fragile. Flood narratives are one of the clearest expressions of this symbolic reset. In the Atrahasis epic, the deluge is both an ending and a beginning, a sweeping erasure of imbalance. While many later traditions treat floods as punishment, Mesopotamian texts emphasize recalibration. The world had grown noisy, crowded, difficult to govern. The gods weren't enraged. They were overwhelmed. A flood in that symbolic framework wasn't a tantrum. It was a reset switch. And a reset always implies a moment before the reset, a strained equilibrium, an uncomfortable quiet, a sense that the old rhythm couldn't continue indefinitely. Take a slow breath here. Imagine water rising along reed-filled banks, quiet at first, then swallowing sound entirely. What would it feel like to believe the heavens themselves needed rest? Divine distancing motifs appear across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts. Sometimes the gods withdraw by relocating to remote shrines in the mountains of purest stone. Sometimes they retreat behind architectural metaphors like the gates of heaven. Massive portals described not as physical structures, but as thresholds of presence. When those gates closed, people experienced divine absence not as anger, but as distance. The gates appear often in hymns to Anu, the sky god. They are said to open when favor descends and seal when counsels turn inward. Scholars interpret these descriptions as poetic language reflecting real periods of social or environmental stress. When drought or conflict destabilized communities, the feeling of abandonment naturally found expression in myth. But alternative readings exist too, suggesting the stories are older than any specific crisis, carrying echoes of earlier cosmic shifts preserved in collective memory. It's possible that these gate motifs encoded a deep cultural intuition that divine presence was not guaranteed, that proximity could fade slowly, like a star slipping toward the horizon. Another recurring image is the divine chariot, or boat departing into the sky. In cylinder seals from Uruk, deities ride winged vessels toward distant realms. The movement isn't violent or dramatic. It's measured, almost reluctant. The symbolism here points toward transition, gods migrating from immediate involvement to a more remote oversight. For ancient listeners, these scenes weren't fantasies. They were emotional explanations. When offerings went unacknowledged, when omens grew confusing, when ritual outcomes felt uncertain, myths of divine travel offered a way to articulate grief without despair. The gods had not died. They had not rejected humanity entirely. They had simply stepped back. Distance, after all, is a softer metaphor than abandonment. Silence is perhaps the most poignant symbol of all. Many texts describe periods when the gods did not answer, when dreams offered no guidance, when divination rituals produced ambiguous results. Silence in these stories is never neutral. It is heavy, charged, unsettling. In a culture where cosmic communication was expected, where stars, winds, and omens formed a constant dialogue, silence felt like emotional absence. Imagine living in a world where the sky once spoke regularly, and then, slowly, began to say less. In some laments, silence is described as a shadow crossing the city, an image that resonates strangely with descriptions of eclipses interpreted as divine unrest. Silence and shadow share symbolic weight. Both interrupt expectation. Both force reflection. Both mark transition. And in the narratives that later hint at Anunnaki withdrawal, silence becomes a kind of foreshadowing, the first signal of a greater departure to come. These symbolic patterns, flood, distance, gates, silence, interlace across centuries of storytelling. Each metaphor captures a different facet of the same emotional truth. Humans sensed loss long before they articulated it. Floods expressed the cycle of erasure and renewal. Gates expressed thresholds closing. Departure scenes expressed transition without finality. Silence expressed the ache of unanswered longing. None of these symbols claim literal history, but all of them reflect psychological history, the way people felt the world shifting around them. And those feelings would shape the next layer of myth, not stories of departure alone, but stories of why. Next, we begin exploring the theories, ancient and modern, that seek to explain what these symbols might have meant, and why so many traditions converged on the idea that the divine world grew uneasy with the human one. Beneath the dust of southern Iraq, beneath the mounds called tells that rise gently from flat desert horizons, entire cities sleep in layered silence. Archaeologists approaching sites like Ur, Eridu, and Lagash now use ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and electrical resistivity scans to read these buried worlds without disturbing a grain of soil. What they find is not just architecture, but memory. Memory shaped by collapse, rebuilding, ritual, abandonment, and return. And sometimes, what they find challenges the clean, linear stories we try to tell ourselves about how civilizations rise and fall. One of the most striking discoveries of the last few decades is the complexity of temple layering. Beneath a single ziggurat platform, researchers often find not one temple, but many, rebuilt atop one another in cycles spanning centuries. At Eridu, for instance, subsurface scans revealed more than 15 shrine foundations stacked like geological strata. Each layer shows shifts in orientation, construction material, and ritual design. These weren't careless rebuilds. They were responses to something: new leadership, new beliefs, environmental changes, or events no longer fully understood. When a temple is rebuilt over and over, it becomes a palimpsest, a text rewritten across time. And like all rewritten texts, some earlier meanings blur. Take a moment and breathe. Imagine lowering yourself into a quiet excavation pit at dawn. The air cool, the walls around you striped with clay the color of old parchment. Every layer is a voice, some loud, some faint, some reduced to whispers. Subsurface scans also show disruptions. Abrupt breaks in occupation layers where ash, compacted silt, or collapsed mud brick appear without clear explanation. In some places, flood deposits several meters thick interrupt normal habitation. In others, sudden burn layers mark destruction. Archaeologists interpret these through careful analysis, radiocarbon dating, sediment chemistry, architectural debris patterns. Most align with known causes: drought around 2200 BCE, political conflicts, river course shifts. Yet there are anomalies too. At certain sites, soil compaction suggests heavy weight once rested on a flat surface, now empty. At others, magnetic signatures indicate large, fired brick structures vanished entirely, removed or repurposed before abandonment. These findings don't point toward fantastical conclusions, but they do remind us that ancient people experienced disturbances significant enough to reshape cities in ways not fully explained by environmental models alone. Modern science proceeds cautiously, as it should, but the imagination remains part of interpretation, especially when evidence speaks in fragments. Temple layers complicate interpretation even further. A lower layer may contain offerings of lapis lazuli and bitumen-sealed jars. A higher layer might include clay figurines of gods with different attributes or inscriptions invoking a different divine name. These shifts represent cultural evolution, but they also expose psychological tremors. Changes in ritual emphasis can signal periods of anxiety, gratitude, or recalibration. Scholars must choose how to read these clues. Some interpret abrupt ritual changes as responses to environmental stress. Others see political transition. A few suggest they might reflect deeper cosmological reevaluations, that people truly felt the divine world had altered its stance toward them and updated their practices accordingly. Science cannot rule on feelings, but it can acknowledge their imprint. Speculative curiosity grows in the gaps where evidence thins. When radar scans reveal symmetrical voids beneath temple floors, some researchers propose storage chambers. Others propose ritual spaces, forgotten crypts, or architectural supports. A few note that these voids appear in places with no construction necessity, as if built for symbolic reasons now lost. Speculation must remain grounded, yes, but it also has value. It keeps inquiry alive. And even the most disciplined archaeologists admit that mystery persists not because evidence is lacking, but because meaning is layered, culturally, symbolically, emotionally. The ancients didn't leave us blueprints. They left stories in clay, foundations in soil, and echoes embedded in ritual objects. Those echoes don't settle neatly. Why does mystery endure, even with modern technology? Because archaeology recovers what happened. Myth preserves how it felt, and neither alone can reconstruct the full experience of living through ancient upheaval. A burned layer tells us a building fell. A myth tells us why people believed it fell. A temple rebuilt at a slightly different angle hints at new priorities. A hymn recorded decades later hints at longing for lost certainty. Mystery persists because human experience is not stratified like soil. It spreads sideways, weaves through metaphor, survives in emotional memory. When people wrote of God's departing, they weren't describing a single event. They were describing the feeling of standing in a world where the familiar rhythms of sky, earth, and divine presence had shifted. And so, as scientific caution meets ancient imagination, we find ourselves between two interpretive worlds, one measured in centimeters of sediment, the other measured in centuries of storytelling. Neither is complete alone. Together, they allow us to listen more closely to the ancient landscape, not as a solved puzzle, but as a living conversation. Next, we begin the long ascent into the realm of questions, the unresolved, the debated, the frameworks through which scholars and dreamers alike try to understand why ancient people sensed divine withdrawal at all. When we ask whether the gods ever truly left, we're stepping into a space where myth, memory, and lived experience overlap. Ancient Mesopotamians wrote of divine withdrawal with a mixture of sorrow and resignation, not as an abrupt event, but as a gradual dimming, a feeling that something once near had drifted beyond reach. But modern scholars approach this idea from many angles, each offering a different interpretation of what those stories might reflect. And none of the theories seek to diminish the emotional truth behind the myths. Instead, they help us understand why ancient people described the world as though the gods had stepped back. One gentle interpretation views myth as a form of psychological evolution. In this view, stories of divine departure mirror humanity's growth toward self-governance. When early societies depended on unpredictable rivers, unstable climate patterns, and fragile food systems, they felt the presence of divine forces in every outcome. As cities matured and administrative systems strengthened, some of that dependence shifted inward. People developed writing, irrigation, networks, legal codes. They began solving problems once attributed solely to gods. It's possible the myths of withdrawal captured this transition. The gods didn't vanish. The people changed. Pause with me. Let your breath settle. Let your mind soften. And picture a quiet temple courtyard at dusk. Imagine a priest lighting the final oil lamp of the evening, whispering a hymn into warm air. Not because he doubts the gods, but because the world around him is learning to stand on steadier legs. Another theory suggests that the idea of divine departure reflects theological reinterpretation over centuries. Mesopotamian religion was never static. In early Sumer, gods walked close to humans, sharing meals in temples, receiving daily offerings, and participating in civic life. But by the late Babylonian period, divine imagery shifted. Gods became more distant, more cosmic, more abstract. Their domains expanded from specific cities to broader metaphysical realms. This wasn't loss, it was redefinition. Just as language evolves, beliefs stretch to accommodate new political realities, new philosophies, and new forms of knowledge. As empires rose and fell, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, each generation reinterpreted divine behavior through its own lens. Withdrawal might simply reflect the natural drift of theology, gods becoming less anthropomorphic, less local, more transcendent. A widening horizon of belief can feel like distance. Environmental catastrophe also left psychological marks deep enough to shape mythology. Around 2200 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapsed amid severe drought, dust storms, and famine. Events documented in both archaeological sediment and tablets like the Curse of Akkad. Entire regions were abandoned as crop failures spread. temple offerings declined, political power fractured. For people living through that prolonged hardship, it would have been natural to interpret these changes through spiritual language. If rains failed year after year, if windstorms stripped fields to clay, if rivers declined until irrigation channels cracked, then divine absence became a poetic explanation for ecological trauma. Not just, why is this happening to us? But why does the world no longer feel held? Environmental memory lingers longest in myth. Drought becomes silence. Storms become celestial conflict. Collapse becomes divine departure. A broader philosophical perspective asks whether departure describes not the God's movement, but humanity's transformation. As societies grew more complex, leadership structures shifted from priest-kings to secular administrators. Power moved from temples to palaces. Knowledge moved from mythic explanation to material observation. The emotional vocabulary of earlier centuries may simply have struggled to articulate this transition. In that sense, departure myths may be metaphors for what happens whenever a civilization outgrows a worldview that once guided it. Something feels lost, even if nothing truly vanished. Rituals change, calendars shift, old symbols fade. People no longer sense the divine in daily rhythms because their attention has moved elsewhere, toward trade, bureaucracy, mathematics, astronomy. The gods didn't step back. Humanity stepped forward. And with every step forward, the space between the old world and the new felt like distance. This brings us to a final, quieter theory, one that honors both skepticism and wonder. Some scholars suggest that myths of divine withdrawal endure because they mirror universal human experience. The loss of innocence, the fading of certain kinds of certainty, the awareness that relationships between humans and the unseen world evolve. Myths preserve emotional truths even when historical details blur. In this view, the question, "Did the gods leave?" doesn't demand a factual answer. It invites reflection on how ancient people perceive change, loss, resilience, transformation. Their stories remind us that civilizations do not only fall physically, they shift spiritually. And yet, despite ruin, rebuilding, reinterpretation, the memory of closeness persists. The longing persists. The sense that something once familiar moved beyond reach persists. So did the gods ever leave? It depends on which evidence we honor. Archaeology speaks of environmental change. Texts speak of emotional change. Theology speaks of conceptual change. Myth speaks of felt change. All four can be true in their own ways. Next, we gather these threads together and turn toward the larger, enduring questions, the ones that have lingered for thousands of years, shaping how we interpret not only the past, but our place within the long continuity of time. Across the world, long before writing standardized history, cultures told stories of divine beings who once walked closely beside humanity, only to withdraw. The pattern appears so consistently in deserts, forests, islands, and river valleys that it invites a deeper question. What emotional truth was being preserved across so many civilizations? In ancient Egypt, in the lands of the Maya, in the philosophical traditions of Greece, and in the mythic landscapes of Mesopotamia, we find narratives that mirror each other with quiet, uncanny harmony. In Egypt, one of the oldest stories involving withdrawal appears in the tale of the sun god Ra. When humans conspired against him, Ra did not destroy the world entirely. Instead, he sailed into the sky on his solar boat, shifting from a god who lived on Earth to one who ruled from above. The myth is not about anger alone. It is about distance. a recognition that the age of shared space between divine and mortal had ended. Priests in Egypt later described this shift as a turning of ages, a transition from closeness to cosmic oversight. That same emotional rhythm appears in Mesoamerica. In the Maya tradition, the gods shaped multiple versions of humanity before stepping back, retreating into the sky or the sacred mountains when humans failed to live in harmony with the natural order. In some versions, the gods withdraw not in punishment, but in sorrow, as if the bond between creators and created had been stretched beyond repair. Archaeologists studying inscriptions in Mexico and Guatemala note that depictions of gods becoming more elusive coincide with periods of political upheaval and environmental stress. Myth often rises from the emotional sediment of real crises. Take a breath with me, let your shoulders soften, and imagine standing beneath a tropical night sky where the Milky Way arcs like a bright river. For those ancient observers, the heavens were not metaphor, they were presence. Greek mythology offers yet another echo of this theme. Early poets wrote of the Golden Age, when gods and mortals mingled freely. But as ages passed, silver, bronze, iron, the divine withdrew. By the time of Hesiod, this withdrawal was treated not as a single event, but as a gradual fading of wonder, a thinning of connection. The gods did not abandon humanity cruelly. They simply stopped appearing. Even Zeus became more distant, ruling through signs, storms, and oracles rather than visible presence. Greek philosophers later interpreted this distancing as symbolic of human maturity. As reason expanded, divine immediacy diminished. Myth became commentary on the evolution of consciousness. The pattern across civilizations is not identical, but the emotional resonance is unmistakable. What unites these narratives is a universal human longing for divine proximity. People everywhere wanted to believe the world was once more intimate, that the distance between heaven and earth had been thinner, that the sky had bent closer, that guidance had been clearer. Myths of divine withdrawal don't begin with despair. They begin with memory. Memory of a time when the world felt held, noticed, nurtured. And when that feeling changed, through drought, conflict, societal complexity, or philosophical growth, cultures shaped stories to preserve the ache. Storytelling became a way of honoring what was felt, even if it could not be fully explained. In Egypt, Ra's retreat framed cosmic order. Humanity must now maintain balance without constant divine intervention. In Mesoamerica, divine withdrawal affirmed humility before nature and warned of imbalance. In Greece, the fading of gods paralleled humanity's intellectual awakening. In Mesopotamia, myths of the Anunnaki stepping back captured a shift that felt both natural and unsettling. Cultures narrated absence not simply to explain a loss, but to recognize a change in themselves. This repeated pattern shows us something profound. Myths of divine departure are not stories of abandonment at all. They are reflections of transformation. Spiritual, environmental, emotional. They preserve a tension between belonging and independence. They express the fear of being left alone and the hope that something still watches from afar. Why does this theme echo across continents? Because humans everywhere wrestled with the same existential questions. Why do blessings fluctuate? Why do disasters strike without warning? Why does the divine feel near in one generation and distant in the next? How do we continue when the world no longer speaks in the same voice? These questions carve themselves into myths because no amount of grain, architecture, mathematics, or political power could answer them fully. Myths gave shape to longing. They offered language for shifts that were too large, too complex, too deeply felt to express otherwise. And so, as we examine Mesopotamian stories of the Anunnaki withdrawing, we see them not as isolated curiosities, but as part of a larger global chorus, a shared human attempt to articulate change. Across thousands of years and thousands of miles, cultures used nearly identical emotional metaphors to describe a world in transition. In the next section, we gather these echoes and turn them toward our central question. What legacy does this pattern leave us, and how does it shape our understanding of those ancient storytellers and ourselves? Long after the last Sumerian temple fell quiet, memory continued to move through the world in ways both fragile and astonishing. Stories of gods who walked beside humans, of celestial unrest, of quiet departures and long silences. These memories survived not because they were carved in stone alone, but because people carried them forward in breath and ritual. Myths traveled through lullabies, priestly recitations, seasonal festivals, and the rhythmic copying of tablets in dimly lit scribal rooms. Even when languages shifted, the themes endured: closeness, loss, wonder, continuity. It is remarkable that a civilization buried beneath millennia of sand still whispers to us through clay pressed with reed. Styluses, archaeologists who kneel today at sites like Uruk and Nippur experience a version of that continuity. Every tablet pulled from the earth is a conversation resumed after thousands of years. Even now, new fragments of the Atrahasis epic surface. Even now, new astronomical tablets allow us to refine ancient calendars. Even now, ground-penetrating scans reveal entire neighborhoods beneath untouched mounds. Modern technology lets us recover what ancient voices tried to preserve, not as fantasies, but as reflections of how they interpreted a shifting world. And yet, the rediscovery is never complete. The cycle of remembering and forgetting repeats across civilizations, much like the rise and fall of constellations across the night sky. Scholars reconstruct temple layers, piece together broken narratives, and compare myths across continents. Still today, gaps remain. Still today, we encounter symbols that refuse full explanation. That persistence of mystery is not failure. It is continuity. What ancient people could not fully articulate, we cannot fully decode. And in that shared limitation, we recognize something profoundly human. The stars above Mesopotamia have barely changed. Orion still climbs the winter sky, the same pattern Sumerian astronomers tracked with devotion. Venus still flickers in its brilliant cycles, a light early priests interpreted as Inanna's descent and return. Even now, those same lights mark our seasons, our calendars, our sense of time's steady movement. The heavens provide continuity where human memory falters, reminding us that the sky holds stories older than our oldest myths. Modern rediscovery has also reshaped how we understand ancient concerns. What earlier scholars dismissed as superstition now appears as a sophisticated attempt to interpret environmental upheaval, political collapse, and shifts in cosmic understanding. Still today, researchers debate whether omens reflect ecological trauma or symbolic theology. Still today, some theories emphasize psychological evolution, while others emphasize cultural memory of catastrophe. Each interpretation mirrors one the ancients faced. How do we understand a world that seems to change around us without warning? There is a quiet humility in realizing that the questions preserved on clay are the same questions we bring to modern astronomy, archaeology, and philosophy. Why do patterns break? Why does guidance sometimes feel distant? Why does meaning ebb and return like seasonal floods? Continuity doesn't just flow from ancient to modern, it flows back as well. We shape the legacy each time we choose curiosity over certainty, each time we read an inscription and allow ourselves to wonder what it felt like to live beneath a sky believed to be alive with mood and intention. And so, the story continues, not only in museum cases or excavation pits, but in you, the listener who has traveled through these layers of time tonight. Every time, you imagine a scribe pausing over wet clay, or a priest studying an eclipse, or a family whispering a hymn at dusk. You are participating in the legacy they left behind. Memory survives because we choose to lean closer, to listen, to let ancient questions echo within our own. In this way, the gods never entirely left. Their presence lingers in stories, in symbols, in the quiet human desire to understand our place in a vast and changing world. And as we step gently toward the final section, we carry that continuity with us into a stillness that connects past and present under the same enduring sky. As we return slowly to the present moment, the long journey through ancient memory settles around us like evening air. The world of Sumer, with its temples and omens and whispered mythic departures, drifts back into the quiet of history. Yet something remains, something you can still feel if you pause long enough. Even now, the same stars that guided their calendars rise above us, steady and unhurried. Even now, the sky carries the same soft rhythms, the same patient motions that once shaped sacred stories. Time changes the surface of things, but not the deep pulse beneath them. If you let your shoulders settle, you might sense how the boundary between past and present has thinned. You're here, in your room. Yet part of you is still standing beside an old ziggurat, hearing wind brush against ancient stone. The questions those people asked, about presence, about absence, about why the world sometimes feels close and sometimes feels distant, they linger quietly across centuries. They don't demand answers. They simply open space for reflection. Still today, we gaze at the night sky and feel small in the same gentle way they once did. Take a breath, slow and easy. Let the weight of the story dissolve into something softer. Some mysteries will never resolve neatly, and that is part of their peace. We can excavate cities, scan foundations, translate broken tablets, and still the full meaning of divine withdrawal will sit slightly beyond reach, but not in a frustrating way. More like a horizon, always visible, always guiding, always just far enough to invite wonder. Acceptance grows naturally when we stop pressing for final answers and simply acknowledge that humans have always lived inside partial understanding. Even now, that shared uncertainty connects us more than certainty ever could. Look at how continuity flows beneath everything we've explored. Stone erodes, but foundations remember. Languages fade, but stories persist. Civilizations rise and fall, but longing endures. And the stars, patient, almost impossibly steady, continue their ancient patterns overhead. They watched the first cities rise. They watched myths take shape. They watched generations look up in fear or gratitude, hoping the sky would speak. Still today, they watch us with the same quiet indifference or the same quiet care, depending on how we choose to interpret their light. When you picture the old ruins now, the fallen walls of Eridu, the worn bricks of Ur. Imagine how the wind moves across them without urgency. Imagine how the sun warms their surfaces just as it did thousands of years ago. Imagine the soft stillness that settles over excavated courts at dusk, the same hour when ancient priests once whispered closing prayers. Even now, the land holds memory without requiring interpretation. It simply exists, patient and unchanged in its deeper layers. So let this final moment be quiet. Let the story loosen its hold. Let your attention drift gently back to the space around you. The ruins continue to rest beneath shifting sands. The stars continue their unbroken paths. The wind continues to pass over places where voices once rose in devotion. And the stone, the old, enduring stone, continues to remember more than we ever will. Somewhere out there, beneath the same sky you see tonight, the past is still breathing in its slow, geological way, still waiting, still watching, still present in ways we can feel but never fully grasp. And the night goes on,